Cool. Well, it looks like people have stopped trickling in, so I guess I'll just go ahead and get started. So, welcome to the talk. I'm Nick Whiting. I'm the technical director of VR and AR at Epic Games, and this is my esteemed colleague Nick Donaldson. Together, we are Team Nick. We've done a lot of the VR work for Epic Games, and today we're going to be talking about the making of the Bullet Train demo. So, how many people here have actually played Bullet Train?
Excellent.
Quite a few, actually. It's kind of surprising given how rare it is to show it at a show. But if you haven't seen it, it's at the Epic booth. It's also at the Oculus booth and the NVIDIA booth on the show floor. So please give it a shot. And with that, we'll get started. So to start off, I think it's kind of useful to say, how did we actually get to the making of Bullet Train? Because a lot of the decisions that we made in Bullet Train were kind of a direct reaction to the stuff that we've done in the past. And kind of like a lot of people that are in VR these days, we're kind of learning as we're going, right? So our first VR demo was at E3 2013 when the Oculus HD kit premiered. And basically all it was is we took a tech demo that we did to show off Unreal Engine 4 and let you kind of walk around and look around in it. It was nothing spectacular, but it was one of the first moments that we were able to kind of see, oh, hey, VR is kind of a cool thing, and kind of internally sell it and get some momentum in Epic. After that, with the premiere of the Crystal Cove with Oculus, we made a game called Strategy VR, which kind of repurposed that same tech demo content in one of our strategy game demos and made a little mini tabletop game. And the reason we did that was we wanted people to kind of look in at something miniature and really kind of exercise the positional tracking that the Crystal Cove prototype offered. Then we did Couch Nights, which was our first kind of foray into trying to make multiple people in the same shared virtual space. So we had a little realistic rendering demo that UE4 has that ships with, and we repurposed that into a little apartment that you and a buddy can share and play this little action figure come to life game. And then for Oculus Connect 2014, when Oculus showed off the Crescent Bay prototypes for the first time and NVIDIA was debuting the 980, we made a demo called Showdown where you're kind of flying through a street and there's all stuff blowing up around you and you're fighting a giant robot. But it was kind of a passive cinematic experience that was really focused on trying just to push the visuals as far as we could go on the 980 and rendering at 90 frames a second, which I've been told is an easy problem. Everybody's got it down pat. No need to talk about that. And then last year at GDC, we worked with the very talented folks at Weta Digital to bring in some of their movie content and render the dragon from the Hobbit films in VR. So if you haven't seen that one, unfortunately, it's very hard to show that one because of IP rights and stuff. But I hope you got to see it while we had it. And if not, if you're ever in the area of Epic Studios, you could probably come in and take a look. But the thing about all those things was that they all had something in common, and that was that we adapted content that we had already made for non-VR applications into VR. With Bullet Train, we were given a pair of Oculus Touches, and since we had the new technology with us, we figured, why not create something new on the content side and really build something from the ground up that was focused on VR. So with that, we had Bullet Train, which we premiered at Oculus Connect 2 in September, I believe. Time is flying. And it was really our first foray into, hey, what does it mean to make a VR application from the ground up, and what does it mean to have touch controllers and hand presence in a game? And so with that, for those of you that haven't seen Bullet Train yet, I've got a short video. Hopefully the sound doesn't blow your eardrums out, but here we go. I can kind of hear it. I can do sound effects. Pew, pew, pew. Ah. Zing. Pew, pew, pew. Oh, yeah. Kool-Aid Man bursts in right about now.
Oh.
That was pretty good. We should beatbox next time. I think that worked out well. So that's kind of what it ended up looking like, but I wanted to kind of go over the design constraints that informed how we made Bullet Train. So the first and foremost bar given to us by Kim LeBerry, our CTO, was that we had to really raise the bar over Showdown. But the unfortunate part of that was Showdown was built for a 980 NVIDIA card, and we really wanted to target the Oculus recommended spec, which was a 970 card. So roughly 30% less performance to play with, but it had to look a lot better. So that's super easy. The other thing that we had to do is, because UE4, traditionally we're known as a games engine, but we're really trying to diversify into other markets like architectural visualization and whatnot. So we really wanted to have a visually interesting environment that we could show to people that weren't in the games industry, weren't into blowing shit up all the time, and they would want to use UE4 to create content. So it's kind of an aspirational piece. We had to have motion controllers, and what we didn't want with motion controllers was just having them tacked in. We wanted them to be a central part of the game. We didn't want a game that you could play on a gamepad or motion controllers. We wanted a game that was designed from the ground up to be on motion controllers. And most importantly, like with all the demos that we've done, we really wanted to take the opportunity to dog food the engine, use our own product, make optimizations, and kind of experience the pain of shipping a product ourselves so that we can improve it for all the rest of you fine folks that might be using UE4. For the scenario itself, one of the other constraints was it couldn't be a sequel to Showdown. That was kind of our original idea. Let's take that and let you fight back as you're going through the streets. But they really wanted something to be a separate experience, not tied to the past. Let's take a clean slate and start from the beginning. As I mentioned, the gameplay really had to be focused on the motion controller, and that was the central. We spent almost all of our time prototyping how do we make the motion controls feel perfect, and Nick Donaldson's going to go over some of the details of that later. And finally, we had to do mostly new content. We didn't want to recycle like we had with all of our previous demos. So we asked ourselves, what should we do? So when we were thinking of architecturally and visually interesting places, we also had the constraint put on top of it that we only had 6 weeks to flesh this out. And we were fortunate enough to have a super talented new employee join us from the film industry, but he had never made real-time content before, so right into the frying pan, and then we pushed him out and put him right in the fire. So he really had no choice but to learn really, really quick. But that also kind of informed our decision. We wanted something that was kind of simple and elegant visually that really kind of stood out. And most of all, it had to fit the gameplay. Since we were doing a motion controller gameplay and it was a VR experience, we really wanted multiple locations that the player can see the world from. We didn't want them to be stuck in one place. So that meant we had to kind of head on address the movement problem in VR. And we also, which we'll explain later why, we needed to have a location that had a danger zone in the middle where the player naturally didn't want to go to. And we'll get to why that is in a little bit. But the inspiration for it, actually, Epic is located in right outside of Raleigh, North Carolina, and the airport there is surprisingly cool and architecturally interesting. So this was one of the main inspirations for the train station that ended up being in Bullet Train. And also the content creator was French, and so he was very inspired by European rail stations, which had the added bonus that they have these nice big archways in them and gives you kind of a lot of playable space. And people generally don't like running into train tracks, and those that do don't last too long. So most people felt compelled to stay out of the train tracks. So this is kind of what it ended up looking early after maybe 2 or 3 weeks of prototyping. You can see it's heavily influenced with the kind of arcs everywhere in the wood architecture of the RDU airport. And so while the majority of the assets that we built for that were custom built, we did have to leverage some pre-built assets that we bought off of various websites and our own UE4 marketplace, actually. So things like the train exterior in the engine were bought off of a marketplace and then remodeled and retuned to kind of fit our purposes. So it was a semi-homemade, as we like to refer to it. We also used the weapon pack off the UE4 marketplace stock with a little bit of retexturing work and remodeling work to make sure that it worked for VR. And we reskinned the character from Infiltrator. The bad guy robot that you see there is a reskinned version of that guy. And the boss at the end was from the Infiltrator demo as well. So we got something that looked good, but we have to do something in this space in order to make a compelling VR demo. So what did we do? The first thing we tried prototyping was what we called Hogan's Alley, after the old NES game where you're kind of sitting and zapping things in an alleyway. It was kind of a basic shooter gallery thing. There were bots that would just run at you. You had a table full of weapons in front of you. You could grab them up and pick them up and blow the crap out of everything. Which was really kind of cool, for people that haven't used motion controllers, just being able to pick up a gun and shoot it is a really interesting interaction in VR. And the other bonus was we were considering doing multiplayer because we had such luck with couch nights. People really enjoy sharing the same virtual space. And this kind of lended itself to it, so you could be back-to-back with one guy fighting robots down 2 alleys and, giving each other high fives when you do awesome. So it was really kind of fitting for that. But the problem was you never moved around, and it got kind of boring just staying there for an onslaught of enemies after the novelty of using guns in VR wore off. So we said, what else is kind of inspiring? And our second topic was kind of Asian action films, like Old Boy and Hard Boiled, if anybody has seen those. But one of the things that was especially cool about those were the one-shots, and that's where the camera doesn't cut. You just have one kind of continuously moving shot through the scene, and the hero is doing something, usually going through a lot of bad guys attacking him. Hard Boiled and Old Boy are 2 very famous versions of that, and it kind of looks like this. The camera's constantly panning at a low frame rate because my laptop can't keep up. And he's beating up enemies as he goes through. And one of the interesting things about this is it solves the motion problem in that we can keep the player moving through a space to keep it visually interesting. But it also kind of constrains the content that we have to make. Since we control the path every time, and we don't have to write a bunch of AI, we don't need a whole lot of animations because it's going to be the same overall experience each time. You can also do cool things like change the direction that the player is going through the hallway if you need to get a little more variance on it. We played around with this a little bit, and it's okay. You just have to be very, very careful with how you move the camera. You can't take any sharp turns like this, but you can kind of slowly rotate them below a certain threshold and the player doesn't barf. But the other thing that's really cool about these Asian action film sequences is that they have a lot of chaining. So as you're going through the scene, kind of going through it, you attack one guy, maybe you punch him, and you can take the gun from the next guy, shoot that guy, and then take his nightstick and beat the next guy. And you get these really cool chains that build upon each other. And it looks badass, and you feel badass when you do it. So we thought, why don't we bring that chaining gameplay into it? So here's kind of an example of one of the chains that we have. We have our hero with the gun and programmer art. I'm a programmer, so it's pretty sweet, my stick figures. So if you imagine a scenario where you're the player and you have two enemies there, you have a lot of options to take them out. Of course, you can just kind of shoot both of them, but we wanted something like, I can toss my gun at that guy, hit him in the head, knock him out. I'm going to teleport to him, grab my gun, and then use that gun to shoot the next guy. And then I get a big shit-eating grin on my face because that was really, really awesome and I felt like badass. So the whole Asian action scenario had a lot of advantages. One of was we could move through the scene like we did in Showdown, and it keeps things interesting. And like I said, it was very constrained in terms of the resource requirements. So for the small team and the short time frame we had, that was actually a really good option. And we thought that this chaining gameplay was something that was really unique and would really kind of play well with the motion controllers. So what happened in practice? Well, as I'm sure a lot of you that have messed around with motion controllers know that it's very important that you never obscure the view of the motion controller. So if you're sitting there, you have your two trackers in front of you, you're playing your game, everything's great as long as you don't start turning. But the problem is, as we were moving the player through the scene, they were beating up one guy. If they didn't quite finish him off, they would start trying to beat him off as they passed him in the scene. And that would cause the players to naturally rotate. And when you rotate, if one of the trackers can't see your hand, you lose tracking in there, and that automatically breaks the experience. So that was kind of a big deal breaker. Movement kept things fun, but we couldn't actually use that in practice because people kept turning around and losing tracking. So what did we learn? Basically, that movement kept things fun. Moving through the scene and shooting stuff was way more fun than standing still in the scene and shooting stuff. And like in Showdown, you can get away with the non-player controlled movement if you do it right. The important thing that we found was you never start them moving in there. We always fade in while the player's already moving at a constant velocity, and that really helps people adjust to it. They don't feel the kind of herky-jerky movement that when you start that tends to turn people's stomachs. The other thing that we learned from the chaining gameplay is that it's really important that we control both the angle and the engagement distance when you're attacking people. We don't want people turning around too far, and we don't want them being too far away from the enemy so that they're kind of flailing forward trying to attack them. So we learned something, but what do we do now? And as all good solutions, it's magic. We figured since you're kind of this disembodied character that just has a set of hands that's blowing stuff up for no apparent reason, we could take the best parts of the stationary shooter in that we can control the distance and you're always facing the action, and add on the elements that we really like from the Asian action film of the movement and the kind of bombastic chaining action, and then just throw the rest of the rules out the window. So since you're already the disembodied set of hands, why not just let you teleport? And that was awesome because it gives us control over which vantage points the players can see the level from, so we could control the content like we could in the other scenarios. It controls which direction that the player is facing because we're controlling the location of the teleporter statically. And it's less overwhelming to players because they control the pace of the action. If they don't want to teleport, they can sit in the same location and play the game. But if they really want to move around, they can jump around all the time. So if you look at kind of an overhead view of the bullet train map, you'll notice all these red arrows are the directions and locations of the teleporters. So they're all facing in towards that danger zone, which is the center of the track. And the reason we do that is so that we can see all of the map from the various vantage points, but we never have to have the player rotate physically in the real world. They're always pointing towards the center, so they're always pointing towards the trackers. So they never, or are less likely, I should say, to lose tracking on one of their controllers. So to make that possible, we use trickery to kind of keep the action in the center of the map, so the AIs favor being in the center of the map, the boss battle starts in the center of the map. Anything that's interesting is in the center of the map, and we put the train tracks there so that people aren't tempted or don't feel obligated or wanting to go into the train tracks, which would cause them to no longer face the center of the map. But to make the teleport work, we needed to add a few tricks to make it comfortable. The first one was the teleport blink, we called it. And originally this consisted of just a brief fade up to white over about a quarter of a second, or maybe a little less than that in the end, where we just fade up to white so that there's not just a sudden cut on there. The thing that we really noticed is that the cut was nice, but you also needed the sound to go with it. So we have a little zip sound that happens, which kind of reinforces both visually and with the audio that the player is moving and changing location. And the last thing we did to help with people getting disoriented because you're beaming and then you're going to be facing an entirely different direction was we left a small particle trail behind you that kind of fades out, but it looks like you've just kind of gone to the other side of the map, and people kind of subconsciously pick up on that. The other thing that we ran into was how do players select which teleport they want to go to. So originally players would look at the teleport they want to go to, hit the button, and then they would be teleported up to that. And that worked most of the time when there weren't enemies, but especially people that were getting a little kind of into the action and whatnot, they had a very hard time looking at something and focusing on something. So we ended up moving the motion, or the selection, to the motion controller. So basically you have a beam that auto snaps to the teleporters, and you kind of point where you want to go and you click, so the player can be finding somebody over there on the right and teleport to the left. And it's a very natural sort of interaction. So that was cool for moving around the level, but when the teleporters were static, you kind of lost that perfect engagement distance that you get that really was essential to the chaining gameplay and the action movie feel. So what we ended up doing was adding something called the stealth teleport, which kind of lets you reach out and punch somebody. You can teleport right up to them, and you're at the kind of perfect hand-to-hand engagement distance. And that really felt really good because you can do things like that chain where you throw the gun at somebody, you teleport to them, grab the gun back out of the air, and shoot the next guy. So that really was essential to pulling off the combo system that we wanted. So the teleporters are a nice solution, but we were very quick to point out that they're not the ultimate solution. They still have a lot of limitations to them, some of which we haven't solved quite yet. But the reorientation still confuses players, even with the trails that pop up. Some players that especially aren't used to VR, when you get reoriented instantly, it's not something that you do in real life. So people aren't used to it, and it takes them by surprise sometimes. The other problem is people still really want to move around their kind of local space, so they teleport to something, but they get really into the action. We've seen people do combat rolls. It's crazy. Equipment often gets shoved around, slightly broken. Walls get punched very often. So there's really not a lot we have found that we can do about that yet. The other problem is it's a game, and the action doesn't always keep in the center. So sometimes, people will be looking around, and AI will, in trying to keep in front of them, will go to the right or the left and cause people to kind of drift around. So every so often they'll be 10 or so degrees off, and then that kind of builds, and then all of a sudden they're facing the other direction. And the other problem is that a lot of people, when they're getting shot at, simply forget that they can teleport. Even though we have a tutorial in the beginning, people just, I'm being shot at. The last thing I want to do is move. I want to kind of cower in fear. So a lot of people kind of forget that they can do it. One other interesting thing that we kind of noticed while we were doing this is there's a slowdown mechanic that's kind of tied to the teleport mechanic. Right now, when you hit the teleport button, you hold it down, time slows down, and you kind of get to pick where you want to teleport. And we did that to give people a chance to kind of catch their breath and see where they wanted to go. And we ended up leaving those on the same button. But previously, we had them on two different buttons. So slow down was a different button than the teleport, because we thought people would want to slow down without teleporting. And compared to a traditional game, Bullet Train is pretty simple in terms of actions you can do in the world. You can grab things, you can shoot things, and then you can do this slow-mo and teleport. But we noticed that since people had never really used these motion controllers before, and a lot of people, this was their first VR experience, period, that was a lot to keep in their head, right? So pressing multiple buttons at the same time, people already had a hard time just reaching out and gripping things. Reaching out and gripping things and having two more buttons to worry about was a little too much for people to handle, and there's a lot of kind of unintentional failure. So it kind of begs the question, are control cords worth it? Pressing more than one button at the same time? Maybe, but we don't think quite now is the time. Once people get a little more muscle memory and used to the equipment, then maybe we can start picking it up. But for now, we really had to oversimplify a lot of the actions. I think people will learn to control things in VR, and once we have kind of built-in paradigms, it'll be like using a normal gamepad. But until then, we found that it's really best to kind of temper your expectations and make things as simple as possible so you don't overwhelm the user with more actions that they need to learn. So we know how we're going to get around, but what do we want to do about the gameplay? We already kind of had the toy box of guns, right? We had guns, grenades, rockets stubbed in, but we really wanted to feel truly awesome and unique and not just a shooting simulator. What we really wanted to do was make you kind of feel like Neo from The Matrix as a total badass. So from the very beginning, especially since Bullet Train was a lot of people's first VR experience and almost everybody's first motion controller experience in the venues that we were presenting at, we decided that we just wouldn't let failure be an option, right? There's no death. You can only become more badass and do more awesome kind of bombastic combos, but you never had to worry about, am I going to die? You know, people, the first time the bullets go through by their head, they think they're going to die, and then they're like, oh, I'm safe. I should just go have fun now, right? Nothing's going to hurt me. I don't have to worry about it. Again, trying to simplify the gameplay as much as possible. But the other aspect to that was that we added a lot of invisible helpers to help people do things that they wouldn't actually be capable of doing. One of the main interactions was throwing stuff in there. So you had grenades, you could throw your guns at people. And it turns out not many people are really good at throwing stuff in real life, right? So, I mean, not everybody's a basketball or a football player, so they don't have a lot of good aim all the time. But the reaction when you throw something and you hit a guy in the face and he falls back is just so satisfying. It's really what pushes it into that badass sense of feeling and accomplishment that we really wanted to make a system that helped kind of cheat people to feeling badass without making it too obvious. So, more programmer art. The player there on the left, say he's faced with 3 guys on there, and he has a grenade, and he wants to throw the grenade and blow some people up. So, he throws the grenade, and usually he completely whiffs it because nobody's really good at throwing grenades in real life. Well, hopefully not too many people. So, what do we do to help him out? Well, we have a vision cone, basically, of where the player is looking at to try to find the potential targets that he might want to throw and interact with. And then we add little components onto the players, so places that you'd want to hit them with in their head or on their chest or on the arms. Just basically places that the designer said it would be cool if you threw something and it hit here. And then we trace out to all of those targets, find the one that's probably the one that they're going for visually because they're looking at it. And then we make an arc that is kind of related to the way that they threw the grenade, but would be plausible for the grenade path. So if I threw this way and I'm aiming at somebody that's straight in front of me, we don't want it to, dart directly at them, but we want to have kind of the same arc from where they threw it. So we want to help them out without making it immediately obvious what we're doing. So I have another video coming up that shows a kind of exaggerated version of this. He'll grab a grenade and throw it at the guy down below him, but it takes a much more direct path to kind of show you how the aim assist works.
No contact!
When the player does that, he just feels automatically really cool because you see the guy falling back and then he explodes. And it's so much more satisfying than just plopping a grenade. So in the basic overview is that you take the view, trace to what are the plausible targets, and compute the path based on how the player actually threw it to find the most likely target. But the real key to this is you can't make it too obvious. You can't differ it that much from how they actually throw. You have to let them still fail. Because if you remember the goat in Jurassic Park, when the T-Rex had the goat chained up, it just wasn't any fun for him. He wanted to go out and hunt real things, and he broke out, and all chaos broke loose. So it's just no fun when you're coddled. Kind of along the similar vein was the rocket throwing. So originally, when the boss comes out, he shoots rockets at you, and we wanted you to kind of grab them and throw them back at you. We thought this was a really kind of cool, fun interaction. So the boss is kind of flying up there on the right, the player's down on the left. The boss fires rockets at you, you're like, oh crap, I gotta grab the rocket. You grab the rocket, point it back at him, and just let him go, and then you hit the boss. And we figured that was a really kind of simple, friendly, for new people, interaction. Here's kind of what it looked like in-game.
You can grab the rockets and aim them at the enemy.
And that worked great most of the time when game designers and gameplay programmers that knew exactly what was going on worked. So, perfect for everybody. But when other people played it, it looked more like this. They would throw the rocket and it would hit the ground right in front of them, and that does not make you feel like a badass. Through watching players play, we noticed that most of the time when people failed, they were throwing the rocket overhand like a football. So they would kind of throw the rocket and then let go when it was too far down, and it would just kind of bloop right in front of them. So the solution we did was, let's take what we did for grenades and let them throw rockets. So the player grabs the rocket, and he throws the rocket, and we average the last few frames to kind of get the intent to where they were going to throw it. And then release the rocket in that direction and add a little visual flourish so the rocket's kind of careening off to the side a little bit. It looks a little more uncontrolled, and it feels much more satisfying when they hit. And that got most of the people there, most of the people that played almost all the way there. But some people, no names, Brendan Arib, the CEO of Oculus, had some trouble hitting the target, so we needed to fix that. So what do we do? So we need to make people that shoot like this actually hit the target. So what we ended up doing was actually, over the course of time, we would start adding in aim assist to it, about 10% each throw that they missed, to make it a little easier to hit the target. So they went from throwing like this to maybe throwing like this to it actually kind of curving back and hitting it almost every time by the end. It's really hard to fail unless you're deliberately trying. But the secret, again, to make it not feel like you're being coddled is to delay when you kick on that aim assist. So it feels like they threw the rocket forward, and then after it gets some distance, you start curving it back up. And people feel like it was their action that caused them to succeed. So our motto with that is the longer you suck, the less you suck. And then that kind of leads us to, meeting the player expectations, right? So as people play the game, you're watching them play test. The best metric of what makes people feel badass is you watch them, you let them play, and you see where they're disappointed. So the pro tip we found here is that if you ask them afterwards, people rarely actually tell you what they're missing or what they were disappointed at, because there's so much stuff going on in a 10-minute experience that you really need to watch their reaction, watch their face, see when they get a grin, see when they're just, kind of disappointed. Watch the player's face as they do it. So our playtest loop for Bullet Train was something like this. We implement a feature, we playtest the crap out of it, and then we listen for when they go, implement something to fix that, and then go back and playtest the crap out of this. And this got us a lot of cool little features that kind of brought us to feeling like Neo from the Matrix. So you can catch bullets and throw them back, because we've noticed almost everybody that went through, when they saw bullets, wanted to grab them and throw them back. So we added that. You can do a Terminator-style shotgun pump. You can juggle guns, shoot the rockets and the grenades out of the air, so you can toss one up and pop it with the pistol. And also the train rings in the very beginning, you can reach up and smack them around, so we call them the boopable train rings, because everybody likes to boop things. So really what we were going for is we wanted to create something like Oculus's original Toybox demo, but with guns. And we really wanted to make the discovery of all the things that you can do really fun and exceptionally kind of open-ended, right? It's a big sandbox full of explosive things. And so to talk more about how we met those kind of expectations specifically, I'm going to turn it over to other Nick Donaldson.
Hey.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Hello. Okay. So I'm going to be talking, I'm Nick Donaldson, lead designer of VR on Bullet Train. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about setting up and meeting the player's expectations. Basically, if you dangle the carrot, they will bite. If you set up players' expectations, be prepared to satisfy them. It can be really simple. One of the first things we did when we started building Bullet Train was to add these little handles on the train, like Nick was talking about, the boopable handles. But they were not always boopable. But the first thing that we noticed is that people got in there and they just wanted to interact with them, especially if you make them physical. Physical things invite interaction. These are very human things. These are built for interacting with. And if you have them, it only takes a really small investment to make these kinds of things get big smiles on people's faces. And as a little bonus in Bullet Train, having these little interactable things right at the start of the experience actually worked as a bit of a tutorial sequence as well. It kind of showed people the limitations of grabbing things. There was some trash on the ground that you can pick up and interact with as well. That's a little bit new for this build, but it worked out really well. Conversely, when I first built the grenades, there was a little physics interacting ring for the pin for the grenade. And people really, really, really wanted to interact with this thing, except, time schedules ran out, and I didn't actually get to implement the pin pulling. And a huge amount of people would pick up the grenade, go to interact with it, and then actually pull them right out of the experience. They'd say, well, am I doing something wrong? And that was a big fail on my behalf. But for GDC, this build, I got to implement the pin pulling, and I thought, I'm a genius, obviously. So here we go, Tommy, our producer, try and play with this grenade. The first thing he does is picks it up, pulls out his index finger on the controller, and attempts to interact with it this way. Unfortunately, that goes conversely to the entire rest of my interaction system, which only uses the grab button. And so he, by interacting with it the way that he expected to, had broken my system. So that actually forced me to go back to the lowest level of inputs in the whole game and rewrite it all so that every object has an option to interact with it with your index finger. But it was completely worth it because it feels great to get an expectation of the way you want to interact with something and for it to function exactly that way. Guns and player expectations. Pew, pew, pew. So when we were making the guns, a lot of people found that they didn't line it up in their hands the way that they expected it to. You know, people would grab a gun and they'd go bum, 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 like this. And it would maybe shoot down to the left or up and to the right or some different way. And the pistol was the worst offender. Interestingly enough, people who had real-life experience with guns had much less of an issue with this, which kind of led me to believe that it was more what people are expecting guns to behave like rather than the way they actually did. And so we needed a really good way to be able to tweak and modify this really easily. And there were two different approaches that I could think of. One, since when we got our hands on these touch controllers, we had just seen the Toybox demo from Oculus, which is a lot of fun. And the way they set up all their interactions is that they have their hand mesh is attached to the controller. The hand mesh goes into a pose, and then they attach the object to the hand. This works really well for them, but there's that level of indirection between exactly where the controller is and exactly where you want the gun to be. It's definitely a simpler approach, and it's really easy to set up, and it's consistent, but it was a little bit hard to align the weapons the way that I wanted. So the way that I ended up going with was to attach the guns directly to the controller. As you can see in this picture here, there's a little like controller mesh in the weapon blueprint, and you just align that up exactly the way you want the controller to be on the gun. And then we actually attach the hand mesh to that, so the hand is just there for visuals. This made getting that exact alignment on the gun really, really easy. And so, you know, it allowed people to, oh, it's a little bit too far down, let me just tweak that for a minute. There you go, how does that feel? And that was the really important part to me. Kind of, there were some downsides of trying to get the animation to line up, and sometimes it pops to a different position, but that was much less important to me than the way the gun actually felt in your hand. So what was the best alignment? Well, I'm still debating that one. Do you align the gun from the palm to the trigger? Because that's actually not quite directly in line with the way the controller is on the Oculus touch controller. Do you align the palm of your hand to the gun? Because it's, you know, the touch controllers are a bit smaller than a real gun is. Do you line at the trigger? What feels really good there? So we ended up going with a bit of a middle ground alignment. You can see in that picture there. Nothing's exactly where you would expect it to be, but everything's kind of close enough. And it turned out, you know, that was all the feedback now is kind of a random scatter shot of, oh, it feels a little bit too high. Some people say it feels too low. Some people it's too low. I probably mean it's a good thing from a design perspective, right? Right? Come on, guys. Work with me. Future work. I have been tossing around an idea of, you know, what if early in the game you ask people to line up really carefully and shoot this target, and on that target they hit it exactly in the middle every single time, and now you use that transform, the way that they thought the gun should behave, to be the way it behaves from now on. That might be coddling too much. It might not be teaching them. I don't know. It might be a terrible idea, but something I like to play with. Seeing the bullets. So bullet speed's always pretty flexible in video games, you know. We had this problem where people would, especially up close on the train, there was a bit of a, you know, training sequence, and people would pull out the gun and I actually recorded all the sound effects with my voice. It was fine. And people had a hard time knowing if they actually hit the target or not, even though we had hit effects and stuff like that, because bullets traveled really fast. If you've ever shot a real gun, it's actually really hard to see if you hit the target or not. So this isn't a simulation. This is definitely a game. And so we had options. So the solution I ended up going with is actually to slow the bullet down to 1/4 of its original speed as it comes out of the gun, and then over a period of 1/4 of a second, or was it 1/10 of a second, speed it up to 1 1/4 times its original speed. So if I was to shoot somebody in the back of the room here, the travel time of the bullet would be very similar to what it was before I made the modifications, but I would have a lot longer to see it coming out of my gun and heading in the right directions. Turns out people are really awful at actually being able to judge change in acceleration of things moving to and away from them, you know. That's why people get into so many rear-end collisions and whatnot. It's kind of really a hard thing to judge. And so literally nobody noticed, other than the fact that people stopped complaining about missing their shots. And it's not that they didn't miss their shots less. to start with. It's that they missed their shots, and then they had the information that they needed to modify their behavior. As I was putting these slides together, I actually asked Nick if he knew about the accelerating bullets, and he had no idea. So, success. So the guns. I had some goals when putting the guns together for this demo. We wanted the guns to feel physical. We wanted to feel like when you're in this virtual world, these are real physical guns. I wanted them to feel visceral. If you've ever shot a gun before, they're terrifying. They're loud. They're smelly. They're really violent things. And so I wanted to kind of express that. And obviously, these things are all serving the fun of the experience. This is my first prototype of the guns, put together in beautiful designer art, a bunch of box components in Unreal. Their actual behavior is almost exactly the way they ended up in the final demo. And this is our slightly more advanced Hogan's Alley type scene. So the solution to trying to make them feel physical was to make them physical, make them physics objects. That seemed like the no-brainer way to start out. And so in Unreal, we have these pretty great things called physics handles, and you can call a function on them to grab a physics object, and you just set the position of where you want those handles to be. And that gives you a really easy interface for dealing with physical objects without having to make them kinematic. It was easy to set up, and it felt really great. Recoil was just by attaching these little impulse actors or components to just the right point on the gun, and then firing those impulses, and it would actually just boom, 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 knock it back. And so it had a real physical feeling because it was, in this world, it was doing all of those physical things. To give it kind of random recoil, just rotate that vector a little bit and apply the same impulse. And it accumulated really naturally as well. A side note on recoil is I've been playing a couple of VR shooter games, demos recently, and I've noticed a lot of people aren't using recoil. I'll line the gun up, I'll pull the trigger, bang, 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 there'll be a flash, there'll be a sound, but my gun stays in exactly the same spot. And I understand there's this dissonance between where you want the gun to be in your hands, but having recoil on that gun to me feels like a really important part of the volatility of the weapon. Even if it's a little bit of movement, I think it's really important. So back to the guns. These physics guns would interact with everything. If I moved it up to this podium, it would bounce off. And if we played a sound on the collision, add a little vibration, it felt really fantastic. But, and there's a big but, the guns would get snagged on things. So if I would pull the gun over here and then pull my hand back, it would sit on the other side of the podium jittering and shaking as my hand was over here and eventually snap back into place. And that was, once that position deviates too much from your hand is, which is kind of, I guess, the problem people are trying to address with the recoil, it's a really big problem. And it was a bit of a deal breaker. So what now? Well, manually simulate all those things that we liked before. Really liked the smoothing of the gun position. I really liked the way the recoil felt with the real physical impulses. And I liked how seamless it was when you picked something up and dropped it again. It was, completely smooth. And so for the smoothing of the gun position, we talk about low latency for hands in VR. We have a late frame update on our motion controller components so that everything's as snappy as possible. And that's really important all the time, right? Well, not so much. You can see in this video here, this is what it looks like after maybe 2 coffees and an AK-47 at full arm's length. It feels like a heavy weapon, right? Yeah. And so it really affected the physicality of the weapon. And so just with a little bit of smoothing on that position, it doesn't take much. Suddenly it feels a lot more natural. Something I'd like to try as well is to actually, instead of just putting a smoothing interpolation on it like this, I'd really like to try a spring interpolation that's hopefully bring a lot more weight to a big weapon like that and take it to the next level. But that kind of gave a lot of the weight that we were missing when it was just a directly kinematic object. Physics impulses. So I really liked the way that they felt before, like I was saying. And after some experimentation, I got some pretty good results doing it kinematically using a timeline. As you can see here, any good blueprint should look like a New York City subway map instead of a pile of spaghetti that you guys are all familiar with. But at the start of the trigger pull, I stored off kind of the relative positions of the gun mesh, and then I just pushed them back in with a bit of a recoil kind of rotation like that. This here is just that timeline playing. accumulating on top. So it's pretty simple. A little bit of a back and forth for the slide on the top, and just a pushback for the whole gun. And then on top of that, I have a constantly interpolating back to the default transform, which is basically your recoil recovery, right? It simulates what you do to try and keep the gun in the same place. I think I accidentally need to play this one. Oops. Play. There you go. So this is what it feels like in the final result, with that interpolation on top as well. And you can see it actually accumulates the recoil really naturally, and then eventually gets it back to the original position once you calm down. So it has this really nice risk-reward for shooting really fast, just like a real gun. So I was actually really happy with the way that turned out. And all of this functionality was built into one master class. So there are different variables for the recoil amount, recovery speed for something like a shotgun, where you don't need to refire it instantly. You can make that take a little bit longer. So it's boom, and the gun has like a real heavy physicality to it instead of feeling a little bit light, like it was shooting a 22 or something like that. And two-handed weapons have a recoil reduction. It's really easy to control these things when you're doing it all kinematically like this as well. The downside is that I really do miss bumping those weapons into things. And just as I was putting these slides together, I was thinking, well, what if we kept the physics, and then once the gun deviated too much from its original position, we turned physics off, or collision off, and then put it back to its position. And I might go and do that after I get back from GDC. Grabbing all the things. The initial prototype was pretty crude. It was just a little overlap sphere, kind of about the width of your hand. I really wanted to, the intuitive thing to me was to simulate what your actual reach would be capable of doing. It's very similar to Toybox. People had a surprisingly hard time actually using this properly. I would give it to them and say, hey, pick up that gun. And so they would reach out and they would kind of just sit there and they would flap their little grab button until their hand moved over it, and eventually they'd pick it up and drop it because they were doing it so often, and then they'd figure it out eventually, but it was a little bit surprising. And then other times people would reach for an object that was clearly too far away from them and just sit there and go, grab, 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 grab. And the first instinct is to think, well, some people just don't have very good depth perception. Maybe they're a little dull. But first impressions aren't always true. So my observation seems to be that when you tell someone to grab something, they've built a mental model of what that is, and that's a single action. And when you say, hey, grab that thing by pressing the grab button, they're thinking, oh, grab. And so they press the button, and they try to expect it to take that whole kind of process. But in the real world, it's a highly integrated sensory feedback loop, right? You reach your hand out. All you're thinking is grab. You reach your hand out, your fingers touch it, you reflexively grip. This is what it looks like in the real world when someone just presses the grab button. It's actually a little bit creepy. I don't like it. This is a real grab. Instructional 101. So there's a few things I can try here. One is add some sensory feedback. What Oculus did in Toybox is they had a little buzz when you were kind of, grabbing state change. It was binary. When you are able to grab something, you feel a little bzz, and sometimes it's just enough to know when you can pick something up, and it worked really well. I'd like to really experiment with something a little more organic, a little more analog. So maybe it starts buzzing when you're capable of grabbing something, and then maybe we do a dot product check towards that object. And the closer to being a true absolute grab position, kind of maybe the more intense it gets. And so, sure, it's not going to give you any more information than whether you were capable of grabbing it before, but it's going to give you a much more enhanced mental model of where your hand is in relation to something, and give you a really deep understanding of how and when you can grab something. Two was highlighting when something is in a hover state or selectable or grabbable. And that actually worked really, really well. It gives a little bit more of that game level understanding. Oh, it's something I can grab now? Okay, let me try that. Or if they see something's changed state, if someone knows how to play games or in general understand kind of game systems, they understand that there's something that they can do with that. An interactable thing is shiny or it flickers or something like that. The initial implementation was through a post-process volume using custom depth. But that kind of broke apart when I wanted to select, for example, on the pistol, you could slide back the top of it like this, kind of the gun porn aspect. And using a texture mask and a material function worked really well to do that kind of just on the object itself. So that was what we ended up going with. Number 3 was to supplement the whole action, like I was saying before. It's a grab action. And so let's just kind of replace that whole grab action for you instead of having to make it really physical or really specific. And so the first attempt at doing that was just to extend that grab volume out. So I could, from this distance, at any kind of reasonable grab distance, and it would just snap into my hand like that. Thank you, assistant.
You always steal my trash.
I do. So this worked really, really well, and it overlapped with another issue we had, that bending over to pick things up sucks. As our little friend here is finding out. It's tough. It's tough. So Oculus Toybox solved this. Like when you drop something on the ground, it would just disappear and then respawn on the table in front of you. I didn't have the luxury of having an ever-present table in our demo. So the force pull seemed like that kind of obvious solution. But how far can we push that force pull, instead of just the arm length that we were talking about before? In a literal sense, about 2 meters is what we came up with. If you want a more useful answer, I've got that too. The problem that we were trying to solve is that the further you reach for something, the further that I extend this grab volume, the further your actions can deviate from your intent. My intent is to grab that coffee off the table, but the previous coffees that I've drunk today are going to make it a little tricky to continuously point in that direction. And so the further away I am from that, the more possible options there are for my hand to interpret those actions. You can see here, this forward arrow, or that red arrow, is kind of a forward vector on the hand. And you can see, if you know what's going on, you can point at things really easily. But this more natural grabbing action, where you reach out like this, some people do that, some people do this, and they bend their hand away from the objects. And that was a problem. So a potential solution to that was kind of using this vector between your eye and your hand. And so instead of a pointing action, it's more of a reaching action. And so the assumption is now that if I'm reaching for something, then I'm going to put my hand between my head and where that object is. That took a couple of assumptions as well. And so let me show you what that looks like. So now that grab works really well. But it turns out your hand is below your eyes most of the time. And a lot of people actually just reach out to the side to grab something. And so then your actions deviate from your intent again. I'll just let you absorb that, because sometimes it can be hard to see exactly what's going on. So this is reaching from the side. Does not work. So yeah, it was much better, but it wasn't the solution. And so what I try instead, or what I end up settling on, is a halfway in between vector, where when you reach for something, it's the vector halfway between where I'm reaching towards and where my hand is pointing. And so if you generally reach towards an object, it's going to start going in that direction, but then we allow a little bit of extra expression by the way that you twist your wrist around. And so if you need a little bit more wiggle room, then that's something that you have by pointing your hand towards it. And this solved most of the user intent. It's not perfect, and I am really excited about eye tracking being built into an HMD, because it's going to give us another tool in the box to really help figure out what the user's intent is. So force grab worked for us. It solved most of our issues with picking things up. It sidestepped some of the issues that we hadn't really touched on here, like when you get really close to something and you can't feel it. For example, if you just try to push a robot, it's a little bit awkward because you don't feel anything like that. And it allowed some really fun situations. So kind of to start wrapping things up, speaking of fun situations, I'm going to talk a little bit about my first bullet train experience. Nick talked about some of the ideas that led us to where we are now. And these are the conversations we had early on in development. I've just finished talking about some of the little pieces that we solved, piece by piece, and we started to kind of put these things together to inform the progression of our development. And at this point, I'm talking about where we started to fit it all together, where all of the pieces started to come together and kind of form a gameplay narrative in my head of the direction that we wanted to take this game. And this is what I call the oh shit moment, where, oh shit, what if I could kill that guy and take his gun? oh shit, what if I could throw my gun at him, teleport up to him, and then take his gun? Take my own gun back. Whoa, oh shit, what if I could teleport to him, grab my gun, grab his gun? What if, oh shit, what if I could do all those things, cross my arms and shoot those fools on either side? Oh shit, what if I could do all of these things in just a moment without even thinking about it? This is the first time I experienced Bullet Train. This is a recreation of that moment. Drop the mic. Thanks, guys.
And we should also say special thanks to all the people that were on the Bullet Train team, especially Ryan Vance, Chad Taylor, Ryan Bucks, Jerome Platiuk, I think is how he pronounces that. And Artem Bolger from Oculus, because they all were instrumental in making it possible.
Badasses. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, any questions?
That's right. We have Q&A.
Trying to get out of the hard part.
I know.
All right, well, we'll start here.
Hey, first of all, congratulations, guys. It's a fantastic experience. I played at VRLA and had a huge grin on my face.
Thank you.
So the question I wanted to ask is, it was a pretty physical experience, almost like improv, kind of like gun dance.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, I was chatting to a friend of mine about it, and he's like, I wonder if it'll scale into a full game experience for a kind of hardcore console gamer who just wants to sit on the couch. Mm-hmm. And I wondered if you guys had thoughts on that yourself.
I think the experience itself does scale because we try to make it a sandbox, so there's always something new to discover. It's only one level right now, so it gets a little. You can spend 20, 30 minutes into it and still have fun discovering stuff, and you get better at the game. People grab the grenade and then shoot the grenade out of the air, and there's a lot of fun kind of combos. I think if you layer on top of that some of the gameisms, like, hey, what about a combo system? What about scoring? What about different environments and stuff like that? You could kind of scale it up. I think the limiting factor is if you've played it a few times and you get really into it, you start getting much more physical with it, and you get sweaty, and it's awesome in an HMD, especially at a place like VRLA where you're putting that on after somebody else that's had that same experience. So hygiene and fatigue, I think, are kind of limiting factors.
And whether it scales to a console experience with some dude who just wants to sit on his couch, it's like, early in the mobile games days, they said, sooner or later, there's going to be full console experiences on your phone, and that's just not what anyone does with their phone. And I think it's the same with VR. You're not in it to play 127 hours of Skyrim on your couch every night. But I think it's going to be a completely different set of experiences, so it doesn't have to necessarily scale to exactly the same thing.
And actually, speaking to sitting on the couch, our QA guy that goes through this all the time, he basically sits in his office chair and has his elbows up on the armrests and actually plays Bullet Train completely with his elbows resting so he doesn't get the arm fatigue. And he's played it hours on end. I feel really bad for him. So, special thanks to Patrick also. He's not on the slides, but Patrick is awesome. And he has very burly arms now because of Bullet Train. Sorry. I guess we'll go this side first.
Hey, quick question. Do you ever think about counter-scaling the bullets as they get further away? I did that in a game once, and it worked pretty well.
Scaling them up?
Yeah, you scale up the further they get.
Yeah. So I actually have this bullet trail on the end of them, and the further away they get from you, they just get like monstrously big trails. And as they get closer to you, actually the mesh swaps, or it doesn't even swap, it's the kind of vertex shader and pixel shader interpolation, where it kind of lerps into this matrix-like blobby thing. And so it changes distances, and it works really, really well.
Wait, how did that get?
Thanks.
This is more of a technical question.
Mm-hmm.
Great talk, by the way.
Thank you.
As far as Blueprint's concerned, optimal-wise, do you guys stick with Blueprint all the way through the process, or do they get converted?
There was no code in this project.
Okay.
It was all
That's
Blueprints.
awesome.
Yeah.
We've got the C++ converter coming up for Blueprints. It's experimental in 4.11, and some people have already used it. But really, we see Blueprints as a way that he and I can work together. Right? I come from a traditional coding background. He's a designer. He hates text. So, it's a language that both of us can speak and both of us can add to it. So I can make a blueprint, he can take that system I've made and kind of tweak it. So that's one of the really important factors, especially with such a small team and a small time. We wanted to leave everything in Blueprint so there was never that barrier. He never was waiting on me and I was never waiting on him.
My questions to him have started changing over the course of the last year or so, less from, hey Nick, how do I do this? And he says, oh, use this node, use that node, to, hey Nick, how do I do this? That's a really good question, and here is a field of research. So, welcome to gameplay programming.
Yeah.
Have you noticed any frame performance issues with that? Or?
Sure, but I mean, there's just like any kind of intermediate scripting language. It's no worse than Unreal Script was back in the old days. So.
Cool. Thanks.
Go back to this side.
Yeah. About the. Just now you mentioned about having low latency not being good for weapons because you jitter around. You went to smooth it instead.
Yeah.
How do you do the smoothing such that there was, because I did something similar before, but there was a problem of the weapon lagging behind your actual hand movement.
So actually, I break it up into two components. I interpolate the position much faster than I interpolate the rotation. And I interpolate them separately. It's not just a transform interpolation. It's position and rotation individually. And so a lot of that flickery, jittery stuff comes from the rotation, just being on a pivot point. And so I interpolate that much smoother than I do the actual position.
Okay.
And if you want to get super nerdy and very technical on it, in addition to doing that, there's also different filtering techniques that you can use. A lot of people use an adaptive Kalman filter. And then a lot of people, I've heard, I haven't tried it myself, use something called a 1 euro filter, which kind of scales based on speed and how fast you're going away from it. And a lot of people have found that works really well for motion controllers because it doesn't add as much latency when you're trying to do fine-grained controls. And it adds a little more latency when you're kind of doing large gross movements, but people don't notice it. So those are two other techniques you can mess around with.
Cool.
Hey.
Hey.
I was wondering, so you're able to pick up a grenade and throw it. So I was wondering if anybody actually ever threw their motion control across the room.
Yes, actually our animation programmer, Lena, Joe's wife here, one time just threw the controller right across there. It's amazing. These touch controllers are indestructible. I put a dent in the wall and it came out perfect.
I threw one across the wall. I've also punched them into the wall multiple times. We've got one that has drywall, like still
caked in between the pieces. Yeah.
It doesn't
kudos to their hardware engineering team. It's brilliant.
They hate us. They really do.
Awesome. Thanks.
Great talk, guys. I just had a few questions real quick with the reach. Did you guys ever try anything with shadows on the hands to help, give more presence of how far the person actually is in hands to give better presence?
So something that we had to do to save on performance is we don't actually have any dynamic shadowing in the project. We faked a lot of the kind of fake blob shadows under their feet, like in the previous talk we gave about Showdown. So there are fake shadows on the character's feet, and there's fake reflections on them, but there's no real shadowing. It does, however, help in my test level. I've tried exactly that, and it works really fairly well, but it doesn't always inform, because there's not always a light that's casting a perfect shadow. Like from this direction, it could be coming this way, and so I won't really have any frame of reference there.
And another question was just from user testing from your recoil. Did you see players ever actually simulating the recoil in their hands from themselves, or was it too quick for that to actually happen?
Not really.
Okay.
People will counter for it. They'll start shooting down a little bit like that. One of the ideas that I have for guns going forward is I really like the idea of having force feedback, but we don't have mechanisms like that. So what if you had a gun where instead of necessarily bang, bang, bang like this, you had to basically shake the bullets out of the things. You're just like, so you're providing the force feedback for it. Or say a shotgun where instead of reloading it, instead of that getting in the way of you shooting the next bullet, what if that is how you shoot the bullet? So you're just pumping, I like those ideas of integrating the physicality of the weapons into the actual firing mechanism.
All right. Thanks.
I like your sound effects.
Like I said, I did the whole thing myself.
Hey there. When you were trying to improve the grabbing with the vector from the eye to the hand, were you then orienting that like collision volume, like for? Yeah.
The collision volume was so in the second video, I suppose. I didn't change the arrow. What was actually doing the eye to hand vector was just the capsule coming out.
Okay, so the capsule was moving up.
Right. So I guess that was a little bit unclear. The arrow didn't change its orientation. All that was just always glued to the hand. And then the collision capsule is the part that we reoriented to that.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks for this share. And do you think, consider using Vive for the touch equipment? Because you use a lot of adaptive design for the touch.
Yeah.
So what will be the biggest difference in gameplay if you use Vive instead of touch?
If we were to use the Vive, the reorientation stuff would be much less of a problem. And so we'd probably just throw that out the window.
Yes.
But in this case, we were making a demo with Oculus on this one, so we had to kind of work within the constraints of the platform.
But the engine abstracts a lot of the details of that away from you. So the same motion controller components and stuff all work. All the input is routed the same way. You just need to have kind of extra flourishing touches because the orientation you hold the Vive controller at is significantly different. And the grips are a lot different. It doesn't feel good to grip stuff on the Vive necessarily.
It's not built for the same function.
Yeah, if you hold that and you try to pull the trigger on the Vive, you get a lot of strain in the tendon under there too, which we noticed. So it'd be one of those things you probably want to rework the controls a little bit just to match the hardware rather than technical constraints for it.
Right. Like maybe you'd make grabbing on a toggle or something like that instead.
A lot of people I've seen have started doing grabbing on triggers on there because that feels like more of a natural hand squeezing motion on the Vive controller. And then shooting by touching the touchpad or something like that.
So will there be a Vive version of this demo?
Not in the foreseeable future.
Not for right now.
Okay, thanks.
From the ledge vantage point, looking down onto the thing, you could probably see pretty much all of the enemies. Did you guys reach like any kind of a limit on the spawn rate, or did you have to cap it?
As many as we have in the scene.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it was 7 in the end.
Always capped. We had to constrain pretty heavily. It was 5 or 7 or something like that. And we just spawn them out as quickly as we possibly can.
And we can drive it a little higher. The thing is, like I said, it was a 10-week total project with me and him, and then we scaled people up for about 6 weeks. So
and we had one of our
tech doc
guys writing all the AI, and it was his first time making a serious kind of AI system.
Kind of begged, borrowed, and stole any man hours that we could get. So it wasn't a highly optimized system. So I mean, we're playing around with it now, and I think we can significantly raise that. We're going to do scalable AI, so 3 or 4 are engaging with you at any given time, and then the ones in the background are just playing simplified animation loop and LOD down and stuff. So giving the illusion of a much bigger crowd without actually having to pay the cost. Yeah.
Hey guys, great presentation.
Thank you.
Just had a question. So you mentioned that there was no like coding in the creation project. It was all kind of just tweaking and using different physics components and things like that. Do you find that, how do you deal with like, let's say percentages of like these kind of abstract values? Do you guys like use some kind of like global metric to kind of like bring everything into like one thing? So it's like, why is this like 0.75 versus like 3?
Right. Well, so for the weapons, I built a parent weapon class, and all the functionality was built into that. And the way Blueprint's set up, it's basically visual programming. All of those same systems are there as with C++. For gameplay purposes, at least. And so all the systems, it was all built on the same kind of weapon system. And so you could set up in the parent class, you could set up a master weapon fire rate scale or something like that. And if something felt bad across the board, you would just tweak it in the parent and kind of multiply the children variables down and stuff like that. So it was very easily tweakable because it was all built on the same shared ground.
So it's like you would have like a master value, and then the rest, the children will all be percentages of that?
Yeah, or potentially, yeah. Okay. It's really easy to set up that way, and that was, pretty much how we did it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hey. Your mic might be off. Oh, there you go.
Hello. Sorry.
Yeah.
Great talk. Question about rendering.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you have fake shadows, but also fake reflections, and also your bullet trails were they look like screen space effects. And every time I've tried to use screen space effects in VR, you get differences between the eyes, and it pops out and hurts.
Screen space effects are usually a terrible idea.
How did you make that work? Or
which part? The reflections,
reflections, and like the distortions.
The reflections are actually pretty cool. We had some, one of our wizards, Ryan Brux, built, we actually were going to show some of these slides, but we cut them eventually. But there's kind of some proxy geometry where there's kind of little mesh sprites that attach to the foot bones of the characters. And then they always kind of pull down and inwards. And because we are using a deferred renderer, we could look up into the normals, calculate a reflection vector, and then calculate what the normal, how much of the normal deviated from the world up, and then distort the UVs of that proxy sprite texture in there. And so I'd have to show you, probably.
It's basically, if you've looked up old school techniques, like on how they used to do reflections on like the PS2 or something, you have a copy of the geometry on a sprite below it, and then basically you're just modifying that reflection. You dirty it up, basically, and blur it out a little bit so it looks like a true reflection.
I think we'll try and put something like that up on the Unreal Engine blog, because it's really cool.
Sounds cool.
Yeah.
And the bullet trails, were they done?
Bullet trails? No, actually, so distortion is something that actually does work really well.
Okay.
Because it is per view, and you get a somewhat believable approximation of what distortion actually looks like. So that worked pretty well.
They were actual meshes, right? Distortion.
Yeah, they were meshes. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Thanks. All right.
I guess that's it.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.